The hush that fell over the Meridian Room was sharp enough to cut glass. Forks froze mid-air. Even the pianist missed a note. At table 5, under a chandelier the size of a small car, a billionaire in a navy suit leaned back and smirked at the woman refilling his water. "Tell me, ma'am," he said, tapping a pen against a contract thick with legal ink. "Got any advice for a man trying to make a few more millions?" Laughter rippled around the table, thin, obedient laughter from people who'd never dared contradict him. Hey everyone, before we get started with today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing steam, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support is incredibly important. Let's grow this channel together. Where are you watching from? Leave your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Grace Palmer didn't laugh. Her red apron was pressed, her hands steady. 54. Silver threaded through her hair. She'd seen enough numbers and markets to know when something smelled wrong. Once, she'd lectured on economics at a community college before hospital bills and layoffs pushed her behind a tray of glasses. She looked at the stack of papers on his clipboard, at the trembling junior associate beside him, and said quietly, almost kindly, "If you keep signing documents like that, sir, you'll go bankrupt before dessert." The laughter died. The air thickened. The billionaire blinked, pen frozen halfway to the page. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone colder than the wine chilling in the bucket. Grace didn't flinch. "The math on your front page, those zeros don't line up. Whoever drafted that contract added one too many." She wiped her hands on a folded napkin and stepped back. "But maybe that's just a waitress talking." The pianist stopped completely now. The entire restaurant seemed to lean toward their table. He looked down, scanning the sheet. The faintest crease appeared between his brows. Then his eyes darted to his assistant, whose face drained of color. Grace turned to leave, but his voice followed her, softer this time. "Wait, how would you know that?" She shrugged. "Some people read menus. I read margins." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then he laughed once, a single, startled sound that wasn't mockery anymore. He folded the papers slowly, carefully, like a man realizing the joke had been on him. Grace went back to her station, heartbeat steady. Around her, whispers rose like steam. She didn't need applause. She'd only spoken a truth no one else dared to see. At table 5, the billionaire sat alone with the weight of her words, the gold of his cufflinks catching the chandelier's light suddenly less a symbol of power than of reflection. Somewhere, deep inside him, something small but solid cracked open. Grace kept working, as though nothing had happened, though every step felt like walking across glass. The restaurant hummed again, but the hum was wrong, too aware, too careful. She sensed eyes following her as she wiped down a counter, the whispers soft as linen. People weren't used to seeing anyone talk back to Edward Hale. At table 5, the billionaire had not moved for a long minute. The papers sat untouched, a small island of white in the sea of polished mahogany. His assistant whispered urgently, "Mr. Hale, maybe we should—" "Find me her name," Edward said without looking up. His tone was even, the calm before a storm. Grace didn't hear him. She was busy helping an elderly couple by the window, smiling as she poured coffee, pretending the tremor in her hands was from fatigue, not adrenaline. She thought the moment would fade, as all awkward moments did. Instead, the door opened, and a man in a dark suit entered, one of Hale's bodyguards, clearly out of place among diners in evening gowns. He went straight to the billionaire, then glanced toward Grace. She caught it. A flicker of unease tightened her chest. The last thing she needed was attention, but attention had already found her. Edward rose, leaving his untouched dessert behind, and crossed the room. Conversation dwindled like a tide retreating from shore. When he stopped beside her station, Grace straightened automatically, her instinct to serve stronger than her instinct to run. "You used to teach economics," he said. "Not a question. A statement." Her breath hitched. "How would you know that?" "I called my office." "You were doctor?" "Grace Palmer, assistant professor at Hudson Community College." You left 8 years ago. Grace swallowed hard. You've done your homework fast. He studied her, not with arrogance this time, but with something sharper curiosity tempered by guilt. Why are you here? She met his gaze without apology. Because sometimes numbers aren't the only things that collapse, Mr. Hale. Sometimes people do. He flinched slightly, as if she had touched something tender. Around them, no one pretended not to listen. The world of luxury had frozen again, but for a different reason now, the raw honesty that cracked through its marble surface. Edward cleared his throat. That contract you warned me about it was fraudulent. My deputy inserted a clause that would have cost me control of my company. You caught it. Grace set down the coffee pot. Then you were lucky someone was paying attention. Luck, he repeated quietly. Or conscience. She smiled faintly. Same thing sometimes. He hesitated, then pulled a business card from his pocket, sliding it onto the counter. Come by my office tomorrow. I'd like to repay you properly. Grace shook her head. You already did, sir. You listened. For the first time that night, his posture softened, pride bending into something almost human. He nodded, folded the card back into his jacket, and left the restaurant without another word. As the door closed, the pianist resumed playing slow, thoughtful notes that rippled through the silence he left behind. Grace exhaled and returned to her work, the smell of roasted coffee grounding her in the moment. She didn't know that outside in the back seat of his car, Edward Hale stared at the contract again, her words echoing louder than the city itself. In a world built on profit and precision, one waitress had reminded him that wisdom sometimes wore an apron. The next morning arrived gray and wet, the kind of New York drizzle that painted everything in reflections. Grace wrapped her coat tight as she stepped off the bus, the city humming with its usual indifferent rhythm. She'd promised herself she wouldn't think about last night, but her mind replayed the moment like a film loop the billionaire's face when he realized she wasn't wrong. It was supposed to be over. A strange conversation between two people from different worlds. By the time she reached the diner for her morning shift, there was already a black car parked outside. Its engine purred like a beast, too patient for the hunt. She froze. The driver, a man in a gray suit, stepped out and held the door open. Miss Palmer, he said, tone polite but firm, Mr. Hale would like a word. Her first instinct was to refuse. Wealthy men didn't invite waitresses for coffee. They made problems disappear. But something in the driver's steady professionalism told her this wasn't a threat. She nodded slowly, wiping her hands on her apron before following him into the car. Edward Hale's office was the kind of place that swallowed noise. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the skyline, and every surface gleamed. Grace felt out of place the moment she walked in, her shoes squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Hale was by the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading a document with the kind of focus that could disassemble a person. He looked up when she entered, the usual arrogance gone. Grace, he said, as if testing how the name felt without the word ma'am attached. Thank you for coming. I wasn't given much of a choice, she said, though her tone held more humor than defiance. A corner of his mouth lifted. Fair point. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Please, sit. She sat but didn't relax. If this is about that contract, I already told you. It's not just about the contract. He paused, searching for the right words. You saved me a fortune, yes, but you also embarrassed me, and that's harder for men like me to admit. Grace folded her hands in her lap. Then why call me here? Because I've been thinking about what you said, that people collapse too. You were right. He tapped the stack of papers on his desk. This company was built by numbers, but somewhere along the way I stopped seeing people. My father used to say wealth is just arithmetic until it meets character. Grace smiled faintly. Smart man. He was, and I've been failing to live up to that. He opened a folder and slid it toward her. Inside was a letter, embossed and formal. I'd like you to consult for me, part-time if you prefer. Financial ethics, community programs, whatever you think this place needs to remember, it has a soul. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "You want me to work here?" "I want you to remind us what matters. And you're overqualified for waiting tables." Grace exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. The thought of returning to numbers, to purpose, was both thrilling and terrifying. "I haven't taught or analyzed data in years. I'm rusty." "Rust polishes off," he said simply. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with decisions neither wanted to rush. Outside, the rain streaked down the glass, turning the skyline into watercolor. "You know," she said finally, "most people in your position would have fired that assistant and moved on." "I did fire him," Hale admitted, "but moving on would mean learning nothing. I'd rather fix the hole that let the rot in." She studied him, the lines around his eyes, the exhaustion of a man who'd spent too long running a race no one ever wins. Maybe he wasn't the villain the headlines painted him to be, just another person trying not to lose himself in the noise. "What if I say no?" she asked quietly. "Then I'll still owe you. And I'll still remember that the only honest advice I've had in a decade came from a woman in a red apron." Grace laughed softly. "You really don't know when to stop making speeches, do you?" He leaned back, smiling for the first time like someone who'd earned it. "It's a flaw. Maybe you can fix that too." "Oh." She took the letter, folded it once, and slipped it into her bag. "I'll think about it. That's all I ask." As she stood to leave, Hale rose as well. For a moment they just looked at each other, the distance between them, no longer about money or status, but about understanding. She saw in his expression a humility she hadn't expected, and he saw in hers a quiet strength that had survived too much to be impressed by power. When she stepped out of the office, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, almost new. She paused on the steps, looking down at the traffic crawling below, and felt something she hadn't in years hope with weight to it. That evening, back at the Meridian Room, the staff buzzed about the billionaire's visit, the mystery woman he'd invited to his tower. Grace said nothing. She tied her apron, rolled her sleeves, and began setting tables. When her young coworker whispered, "Is it true you made him listen?" she just smiled. "Sometimes," she said, straightening a fork, "the loudest truth is the one said softly." And somewhere high above the city, Edward Hale looked out over the skyline, replaying her words, wondering how one woman with nothing to gain had managed to change the direction of his empire. He didn't know yet that she would return the next week, not for the job, not for the money, but to make sure he kept his promise. Because Grace had lived long enough to know that redemption isn't found in contracts. It's found in what you choose to sign next. A week later, the Meridian Room glittered brighter than usual. The anniversary gala of Hale Investments drew in every major figure in finance, investors, politicians, and journalists hungry for spectacle. Waiters moved in a practiced ballet, crystal glasses flashing under chandeliers. Grace stood among them, no longer in her red apron but in a simple charcoal dress. She wasn't working tonight, she'd been invited. The invitation had come sealed with Hale's insignia, handwritten in deliberate ink. "You once told me some numbers don't add up. Maybe you can help me fix a few more." She hadn't answered immediately. Pride told her not to go, but curiosity mixed with a faint sense of unfinished business brought her there. She lingered at the edge of the ballroom, unnoticed in a sea of polished wealth. Edward Hale was on the stage, addressing the crowd with a voice that carried authority but none of the arrogance it once held. "For years," he said, "I measured success by profit margins. I was wrong. A company without integrity is a house built on sand. Tonight, we start rebuilding on solid ground." Grace felt something shift in the room. Some guests clapped automatically, others exchanged skeptical glances. But she could see sincerity in his posture, the way his shoulders squared, the faint tremor in his hand as he held the microphone. It wasn't performance. It was confession. After his speech, waiters began serving dinner. Edward stepped down from the stage, shaking hands and smiling as cameras flashed. When he spotted her near the column by the window, his expression softened. He excused himself from a cluster of CEOs and crossed the floor. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "Neither was I," Grace replied, watching the city lights glitter below, "but I wanted to see if you meant what you said." He gestured toward the crowd. "We're announcing a fund tonight. Community programs, small business mentorships. You inspired that." She laughed softly. "You don't owe me credit." "It's not about credit," he said. "It's about direction." For a moment, neither spoke. The music swelled, a jazz band playing something slow and nostalgic. Edward's voice dropped. "Would you dance with me, Grace?" She hesitated, then smiled. "I'm more of a numbers person than a dancer." "So am I," he said, extending his hand anyway. "But sometimes the balance sheet can wait." She took his hand, surprised by how natural it felt. They moved carefully at first, two people unused to surrendering control. Around them, conversation buzzed, but Grace only heard the rhythm of the music and the faint echo of her own heartbeat. "You've changed," she said. He smiled, eyes fixed on her. "No, I just started listening." The words carried weight. Grace thought of the contract, of the diner shifts, of the years spent surviving instead of living. It was strange how quickly a single act of honesty could redraw an entire life. When the song ended, applause rippled through the ballroom. Edward stepped back, bowing slightly. "You made me face myself," he said quietly. "That's not something money can repay." "Then don't repay it," she said. "Pay it forward." He nodded, understanding the layers beneath the phrase. Around them, cameras flashed again, capturing an image that would later make headlines: "Billionaire dances with former waitress who saved his company." The next day, newspapers buzzed with speculation. Some called it a publicity stunt. Others called it redemption. Grace didn't read them. She spent her morning at the small apartment she shared with her sister, feeding the cat, brewing coffee, and checking the mail. Among bills and flyers, one envelope stood out, a letter from Hale's Foundation. Inside was a scholarship certificate in her name. For continuing education in economic ethics and community development. She sat at the table for a long while, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. It wasn't about the money. It was about the door it opened, a door she thought had closed forever. That afternoon, she walked back to the Meridian Room for the first time since the gala. The staff greeted her like a returning legend, and the manager, half in awe, said, "He really listened, didn't he?" Grace smiled. He had to. The truth was too loud. She stayed through the dinner rush, helping the younger waiters polish glassware and fold napkins. When she caught her reflection in the mirror behind the bar, she saw the same lines and silver hair, but something in her eyes had changed. Resolve. Peace. A sense that the story wasn't just about one lucky encounter, but about the small power of doing the right thing when no one's watching. As she left that night, the city wind brushed her cheeks, carrying faint traces of music from a street saxophonist. She paused, looking up at the skyline. Somewhere in one of those glass towers, a man was reviewing numbers differently, now seeing faces behind every digit. Grace smiled, pulling her coat tighter. The world hadn't changed overnight, but maybe it didn't need to. Sometimes one honest sentence was enough to turn a joke into a lesson and a lesson into a legacy. She crossed the street, lights flickering across wet pavement, and disappeared into the evening crowd. Another ordinary figure in an extraordinary city, carrying nothing but a simple truth. That wisdom doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it ties on an apron and speaks softly enough to stop the noise of an entire room. 2 months passed before Grace saw Edward again. The snow had come early that year, softening the edges of the city and covering its noise in a quiet blanket. She still worked part-time at the Meridian Room, not because she needed to, but because it grounded her. The scholarship Hale's Foundation had provided covered her tuition for an evening program at NYU, a class on ethics in modern economics. Each night she returned home with her mind buzzing again, the same way it had years ago when she still believed knowledge could change the world. That afternoon she was polishing the last of the wine glasses when a familiar voice drifted from the entrance. "You still make this place look like it runs on precision." Grace turned, surprised. Edward stood by the door, shaking snow from his coat. He looked different, more relaxed, almost human. No entourage, no flashing watch. Just a man who'd traded sharp edges for something softer. "Mr. Hale," she greeted. "You're a hard man to miss in this neighborhood." He smiled. "You can drop the mister. I think we've earned first names by now." She arched an eyebrow. "So what brings you here? Lost another contract?" "Not yet," he said, grinning. "I came to ask a favor." Grace set the last glass down. "That sounds dangerous." He nodded toward an empty booth by the window. "Join me for coffee?" They sat across from each other as snow fell outside, silent and heavy. For a while neither spoke. Grace noticed how his hands no longer fidgeted with a pen or phone. He seemed comfortable in stillness. "I've been thinking about what you said that night," he began. "About paying it forward. We launched the mentorship fund last month. 40 small businesses have applied already." "That's good news," she said, genuinely pleased. "It is," he said, then leaned forward. "But I realize something. Money fixes problems. It doesn't change hearts. You do. That's why I want you to help us build the next program. Teach financial literacy, especially to women starting over." Grace's instinct was to decline. She'd had enough of boardrooms and titles, but this was different. "You want me to teach?" she asked slowly. "Not for me," he said. "With me." The simplicity of it silenced her. She thought of the faces she'd seen at the diner, single mothers counting tips, retired workers managing pensions that barely lasted the month. Maybe she could help them understand what the system never bothered to explain. She nodded. "All right. But on one condition, no photo ops, no press releases." Edward chuckled. "Deal. I've had enough headlines for one lifetime." They talked for hours about ideas, about mistakes, about the strange way failure humbles a man faster than success ever could. When the snow finally stopped, the windows fogged with warmth, and the city outside glowed in streetlight gold. As he stood to leave, Edward hesitated. "Grace, that first night, when you said I'd go bankrupt, did you mean it as an insult or a warning?" She smiled faintly. "Both. I figured if one didn't reach your ego, the other might reach your conscience." He laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. "It did, eventually." He started toward the door, then turned back. "There's one more thing. Tomorrow we're dedicating a new training center under the foundation. I'd like you to cut the ribbon." "Me?" she said, startled. "That's your stage." "No," he said softly. "It's yours." The next day, the hall was filled with journalists, local students, and business owners. Grace stood beside him, scissors trembling slightly in her hand. When the curtain dropped to reveal the plaque, her breath caught. The engraved words read, "The Grace Palmer Institute for Ethical Finance," for the voice that turned a joke into justice. The applause rose like a wave. Cameras flashed. Grace blinked against the light, feeling heat rise behind her eyes. Edward clapped beside her, but his expression wasn't pride, it was gratitude. Later, when the crowd dispersed, he found her standing alone by the sign. "You earned that," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I didn't earn anything. I just spoke." "Oh." "Exactly," he said, and the world listened. Outside, the wind had softened. Snowflakes drifted in lazy spirals. Grace walked with him to the curb where his car waited, her footsteps crunching in rhythm with his. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Before he got in, he turned to her one last time. "You know, the night I met you, I thought I was making a joke, but maybe the universe was the one making it on me." Grace smiled. "The best lessons start as jokes, Mr. Hale. We just have to be willing to laugh at ourselves." He laughed quietly, closed the door, and the car pulled away into the dusk. Grace stood there for a long time, watching the taillights disappear into the snow. Back inside, the empty hall echoed with the faint sound of her footsteps. She looked up at the sign once more, touched the edge of her name and whispered, "For every waitress still waiting to be heard." And as she stepped back into the night, she realized something simple but profound. Redemption wasn't a gift you received, it was a light you passed on. Hers had started with one sentence, spoken not to shame, but to remind. In a city obsessed with power and profit, Grace Palmer had proven one truth. Even the smallest voice, when honest enough, can change the cost of everything. Winter melted into spring, and with it New York shed its gray coat. The streets bloomed with energy again, yellow cabs, food carts, laughter rising from the sidewalks like steam. For Grace, life had taken on a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Mornings of study, afternoons teaching at the new institute, evenings spent walking home through the park, the city's noise now sounding less like chaos and more like heartbeat. She hadn't seen Edward in weeks, though his presence lingered in quiet ways. A stack of thank you letters from scholarship recipients arrived at her apartment. A new shipment of textbooks appeared at the institute's doorstep, anonymously funded. Every so often, a bouquet of white tulips, her favorite, waited on her desk. No card, just the initials, E.H., scribbled on the wrapping. One Friday afternoon, she was tidying up after class when she noticed a young woman standing nervously in the doorway, barely 20, dressed in a faded coat 2 sizes too big. Her hands clutched a worn notebook. "Miss Palmer?" the girl asked softly. I don't have an appointment. They said I could maybe talk to you anyway." Grace smiled. "Of course. Come in." The girl introduced herself as Lila, a waitress from Queens. She'd heard about the Institute's free evening seminars and wanted advice on starting a small bakery. "But the numbers never add up," she admitted, eyes dropping to the floor. "I feel stupid even trying." Grace felt something twist warmly in her chest. "Then you're already halfway to success," she said, "because people who think they know everything never learn a thing." They spent the next hour going over Lila's notes. Her handwriting was careful, her dreams simple, a bakery that hired women who'd aged out of foster care. Grace found herself sketching budgets, explaining interest rates, simplifying spreadsheets into stories. "Each dollar," she said, "is a promise you make to your future. Keep the promises small, but keep them." By the time Lila left, the sun had dipped low, casting the classroom in amber light. Grace sat back, smiling to herself. It struck her that she was repeating the same act that had changed her life, sharing truth plainly, without pretense. Only now, she was on the other side of the equation. That night she walked home through the park. Near the fountain, a man stood feeding pigeons, tall and unmistakably familiar even in casual clothes. Edward turned when he saw her, his grin lighting up like a boy caught doing something ordinary. "Do billionaires feed pigeons now?" she teased. "Only the retired kind," he said, "or the reformed ones." They walked together along the path past blooming magnolias and joggers rushing by. There was a calm between them that didn't need words. "I heard about Lila," Edward said. "She wrote to the foundation. Said you're the first person who's ever made numbers make sense." Grace chuckled. "She's going to make it. You can tell when someone dreams responsibly." He stopped beside a bench, looking out over the pond. "You know, before I met you, I thought leadership meant control. Now I think it means listening." She studied him, the way the fading sunlight softened the lines of his face. "And what have you been listening to lately?" "Mostly silence," he said, smiling. "It's surprisingly loud." They sat, the hum of the city wrapping around them. A street musician nearby played a saxophone, the notes drifting like lazy smoke. "I'm leaving New York for a while," Edward said finally. "The board wants me to oversee the new branches in Chicago and Dallas. It's time I handed things off." Grace nodded, though she felt an unexpected pang. "So this is goodbye?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "I hope not. But even if it is, I'll leave knowing something important, that the company's best investment wasn't in tech or property. It was in people. And you taught me that." She looked down, her voice softer. "I didn't teach you anything you didn't already know. I just reminded you." A silence stretched between them, full of gratitude and a touch of sorrow. The sun sank lower, painting the pond in gold. Edward stood and extended a hand. "Walk with me one last time?" They circled the pond slowly, their footsteps syncing with the rhythm of the city's heartbeat. When they reached the park gate, he turned to her. "Grace, if you ever change your mind about teaching, about the foundation, about anything, my door will always be open." she smiled. I know, but I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded. Then promise me one thing. What's that? Keep speaking, even when no one's listening. Especially then. She felt the sting of tears, but blinked them away. That's an easy promise. He took her hand gently, pressed it once, then walked toward the street. The city swallowed him in a blur of motion, black car, flashing lights, the endless hum of traffic. Grace stood there until he was gone. When she finally turned back toward home, the first stars had appeared above the skyline. She thought of the young waitress with the notebook, of the students in her class, of the quiet ripples that truth creates long after the noise fades. And she realized that life had come full circle. Once she had spoken a sentence that froze a room. Now she spent her days helping others find their sentences that wouldn't freeze, but free. As she crossed the park, her breath visible in the cool air, Grace whispered to herself, not a prayer, not a wish, just a truth. Every empire falls, but kindness endures. And with that, she disappeared into the pulse of the city, carrying the same calm fire that had changed everything, a light strong enough to reach even the coldest boardroom, reminding the powerful and forgotten alike that wisdom doesn't shout. It simply speaks and waits for the world to listen. Summer rolled into the city with the smell of hot asphalt and roasted chestnuts from sidewalk carts. The air shimmered above the taxi roofs, and the skyline gleamed like steel under fire. Grace had grown used to walking through this heat, her tote bag heavy with lesson plans, her hair pinned up, her heart oddly light. Life had settled into something steady, even sweet. The Grace Palmer Institute had become more than a classroom. It was a movement. People who had once believed finance was a language only the rich could speak now filled the halls, learning to decode their own futures. Every night, laughter drifted through the windows, the sound of discovery. Grace often stayed late, listening from the hallway that laughter was her reward. One evening, she was erasing the whiteboard when the door creaked open. A man in a navy suit stepped inside, tall, polite, carrying an envelope. His presence instantly shifted the air. Grace Palmer? She turned, startled. Yes? He handed her the envelope, embossed with a government seal. It's from the Department of Education. They've nominated you for the National Service Award. Congratulations. Grace blinked. That must be a mistake. The man smiled. I don't think so, ma'am. You've helped over 5,000 adults complete our financial literacy program. You've changed neighborhoods. When he left, Grace sank into a chair, the envelope still unopened in her lap. She thought of the long nights she'd spent, wondering if what she did mattered the times the rent was late. The headaches, the exhaustion. And now this, a recognition she hadn't chased from a world she thought had forgotten her. She smiled, not out of pride, but gratitude. The kind that humbles more than it lifts. That night, unable to sleep, she walked to the river. The Hudson glittered beneath the city lights, restless and infinite. She stood by the railing, the breeze teasing her hair, and found herself whispering into the wind. We did it, didn't we, Edward? As if the city heard her. A car horn echoed from the far side of the pier. When she turned, she saw him, or at least she thought she did a familiar silhouette leaning against a silver sedan. For a heartbeat, her heart tripped. But when the headlights changed, the figure was gone. Only shadows and mist remained. She laughed quietly. You're still haunting me, Hale. A few days later, a letter arrived at the Institute with no return address. Inside was a short note, typed neatly. Grace, I heard about the nomination. I'm in Geneva now, advising a global ethics council. Seems your lessons travel faster than you think. Remember what you told me once, that every truth needs a witness. You were mine. With respect and affection, Edward. Grace read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, slipped it into her notebook, and went back to class. The students were already waiting, notebooks open, eager to learn. She began the day's lesson with her usual calm authority, but there was a softness in her tone, a new steadiness that came from knowing her story had not ended in that restaurant. It had only begun there. "Today," she said, writing on the board, "we're talking about the cost of value. Not everything worth something has a price, and not everything with a price is worth something." Hands went up, questions sparked, and the room filled with energy. Grace watched them, the janitor from Brooklyn, the single mother from the Bronx, the taxi driver from Queens, all hungry to understand a system that had once shut them out. These were her people, and in their eyes she saw the same mix of fear and courage she'd once carried herself. After class, she stepped outside into the golden wash of late afternoon. Across the street, the bakery Lila had opened a few months ago was thriving. The window displayed cupcakes shaped like coins, a wink to the Institute's lessons. Lila spotted her through the glass and waved. Grace waved back, pride blooming like sunlight in her chest. Later, as she walked toward the subway, her phone buzzed a message from a number she didn't recognize. "Check the news," it read. She stopped beneath a street lamp, opened the link, and saw the headline. Edward Hale appointed to lead global initiative on ethical investments. Beneath it was a photograph, Hale, older, composed, standing before a banner that bore the same motto engraved at her institute. "Integrity is the only currency that never loses value." Grace's throat tightened. She closed her phone, the city noise rushing back around her like applause. When she got home that night, she placed his letter on her desk beside the award nomination. Outside her window, the lights of Manhattan shimmered, endless and alive. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the sill, and whispered, "Keep listening, Edward. The world finally is." She thought back to that night at the Meridian Room, the hush, the frozen forks, the man with too much power and not enough perspective. Who could have guessed that a few quiet words from a tired waitress would echo so far? A laugh escaped her, soft but full. She picked up a pen and began drafting the speech she would give if she accepted the award. She knew exactly how she would start. This story began not with a victory, but with a mistake, a joke told by a man who thought wealth meant wisdom, and a reply from a woman who had nothing left to lose but her voice. Turns out that was enough. Oh, when she set the pen down, the night had deepened. Somewhere in the city, church bells marked the hour. Grace closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of rain on pavement, and felt peace settle in her bones. The world had changed, not in headlines or in markets, but in quiet ripples, one conversation, one classroom, one moment of courage at a time. And when the breeze swept through the window, lifting the edge of Hale's letter, Grace let it flutter to the floor like a blessing. The city whispered back, steady and warm, carrying her truth through its endless hum. Even the smallest voice can start an echo that never dies. Autumn crept back into the city like an old song, carrying the smell of roasted nuts and rain-soaked leaves. The skyline shimmered gold in the late afternoon light, and the air had that crisp sharpness that made people hurry without knowing why. For Grace, the season always felt like reflection, a quiet turning inward after the long, bright noise of summer. The Grace Palmer Institute was thriving. Enrollment had doubled. Donations flowed in from companies eager to attach their names to something noble. Yet, Grace kept her office small and her desk simple. Just a lamp, a stack of student essays, and one framed photo of the Meridian Room, a gift from the staff who still called her Professor Grace whenever she stopped by. She liked to look at it sometimes, to remind herself where it had all begun. One chilly evening, she stayed late reviewing proposals for the next year's curriculum. The streets outside glowed with the amber wash of traffic lights. A knock sounded on her door. She looked up, expecting a student, but froze. Edward Hale stood there. He looked thinner, paler. There were faint lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You're supposed to be in Geneva," she said. He smiled faintly. "I was. Now I'm back. Temporarily." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "You didn't come all this way just for small talk." He sat, folding his hands on his knee. "I came because I wanted to see where it started. You wouldn't believe how many people mention your name overseas. You've become the symbol of reform, Grace." She gave a soft laugh. "You make it sound like I planned any of this." "You didn't," he said. "That's what makes it real." "Oh." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence. The hum of the city below filled the pauses. Grace noticed the tiredness behind his smile. "You're not just here for nostalgia, are you?" Edward exhaled, gaze dropping. "I'm sick, Grace. Nothing dramatic, just time catching up. The doctors say I need to slow down." Her heart clenched. "Edward," he held up a hand gently. "Don't look at me like that. I've had a good run. But before I step back completely, I wanted to make sure the foundation continues under someone who won't let it lose its soul." She blinked, realizing what he meant. "You want me to take it over? I don't want anyone else to. You're the conscience of what we built." Grace leaned back, shaking her head. "Edward, I'm a teacher. I'm not built for corporate politics." He smiled, that old spark flickering through his exhaustion. "Neither was I until a waitress reminded me to listen." "Oh?" She wanted to protest, but something in his tone stopped her. It wasn't a plea, it was a passing of the torch. He wasn't asking out of weakness, but faith. He stood, slipping a sealed envelope onto her desk. "Think about it. Everything you need is in there. I'll be leaving for treatment next week. If I don't come back—" "Don't," she said softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, then I'll just say thank you for everything." When he left, the scent of rain followed him. Grace sat alone, staring at the envelope for a long time. She didn't open it right away. She simply sat, listening to the hum of traffic outside, the sound of life continuing as it always did. Finally, she whispered to the empty room, "You always did have terrible timing, Edward." Days passed before she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in his precise style. "Grace, leadership isn't about having the loudest voice. It's about being the one who keeps speaking when the room goes quiet. I built a company. You built a conscience. Please, make sure it doesn't die when I do. E.E." She read it twice, then folded it carefully. That night, she walked to the Institute's courtyard, where the first autumn leaves had begun to fall. The city buzzed beyond the gate, impatient and alive. But in that small square of quiet, Grace felt something close to peace. Weeks later, news broke that Edward Hale had passed away in Switzerland. The world mourned a philanthropist, an architect of ethical reform. Grace mourned something more personal, a man who had learned too late what it meant to listen, but who had still chosen to change. The Foundation's board reached out, just as his letter said they would. After long nights of thought, Grace accepted the position. On her first day as director, she wore her old red apron under her blazer, a private reminder of where integrity was born. At the ceremony, reporters crowded around her, microphones raised. Someone shouted, "Miss Palmer, what will change under your leadership?" Grace paused, the cameras flashing like lightning. She could have spoken about strategy or policy, but instead she said quietly, "We'll keep doing what we've always done, reminding the powerful that truth doesn't need volume to be heard." Alwer. The words spread through headlines the next day. Some called her idealistic, others called her naive. Grace didn't care. The Institute and the Foundation merged within a year, funding education programs across 5 countries. Each one bore a small plaque at its entrance that read, "Founded on a conversation between a billionaire and a waitress." Every time she passed one, Grace smiled. She could almost hear Edward's voice teasing, "You always did get the last word." But the truth was, it had never been about winning. It had always been about awakening. And as the city lights blinked alive that evening, Grace understood something simple yet profound. Legacy isn't measured by how long your name is remembered. It's measured by how many lives can still speak after yours grows silent. She stood at her window, the skyline burning orange against the dusk, and whispered to the fading light, "You kept your promise, Edward. Now it's my turn." "Oh." And somewhere between the hum of traffic and the whisper of leaves, she could almost swear the city whispered back. Winter returned with quiet dignity, dusting the city in silver. The skyline looked softer under snow, the noise of traffic muffled into a steady hum. Inside the glass tower that now bore the names Hale and Palmer Foundation, Grace sat at her desk, looking out over Manhattan. The city pulsed beneath her, like a living map of choices, some selfish, some brave, all connected. It had been a year since Edward's passing. His portrait hung in the lobby, caught mid-laugh, a reminder that even the powerful could learn humility. The foundation thrived beyond anyone's expectations. Under Grace's leadership, programs expanded to 40 cities, teaching ethics, finance, and civic responsibility. But she'd kept her promise: no marble offices, no lavish events. The walls stayed white, the coffee cheap, the focus human. Still, the work was heavier than she had imagined. Each day brought new reports of corruption, new crises to solve. Some nights she'd linger long after the staff had gone, the city lights flickering against the glass like Morse code. That was when she missed Edward most, not his wealth or his charm, but his ability to make her laugh in the middle of chaos. That evening, as she reviewed a grant proposal, a knock interrupted her thoughts. A young man entered, early 30s, crisp suit, nervous eyes. "Miss Palmer," he said. "Sorry to disturb you. There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she insists it's important." Grace sighed, setting down her pen. "Who is she?" "She says her name is Lila." Grace's expression softened. "Send her in." Moments later, Lila entered, now confident and composed, flower dust still faint on her sleeves. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You never are," Grace said, rising to hug her. "How's the bakery?" "Thriving," Lila smiled. "We just opened our second location, but that's not why I'm here." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a golden key. "I wanted you to have this. It's the first shop's spare key. I wouldn't have that place or my life without you." Grace looked at the key, speechless. "You told me once that each dollar is a promise," Lila continued. "Well, I kept mine. Every month, we feed anyone who can't afford a meal. No receipts, no questions. Just food. I call it Grace Night." For a moment the room blurred. Grace blinked back tears. "You didn't need to do that." "I did," Lila said gently, "because kindness doesn't end with advice. It multiplies." After Lila left, Grace stood by the window, the golden key warm in her palm. Snow was falling again, drifting down between skyscrapers like quiet applause. She thought of Edward's letter, of that long-ago evening at the Meridian Room, how one sentence had stopped the noise of an entire restaurant and started an echo she was still hearing. Later that week, she traveled to a new community center in Brooklyn, funded by the Foundation's outreach program. Children's laughter bounced off the walls as volunteers handed out art supplies. On the far wall, a mural depicted a diner scene. A waitress standing before a suited man, her hand mid-gesture, his face frozen in surprise. Below it, painted in gold, were the words, "Integrity begins when no one expects it." Grace ran her fingers over the mural's edge. The paint was fresh, the message timeless. As she turned to leave, a small boy tugged her sleeve. "Miss Grace," he asked shyly, "is that you in the painting?" She smiled. "Maybe, but it's also your mom, your teacher, anyone who ever told the truth when it was hard." He nodded, solemn and satisfied, before darting back to his friends. That night, Grace walked home alone. The wind off the Hudson bit through her coat, but she didn't hurry. The city glittered like 1,000 small stories, lives colliding, breaking, mending. She passed the old restaurant, now renovated and renamed the Hale Room. Through the window, she could see a young waitress wiping a table, her face lit by the same chandelier that had once framed Grace's moment of defiance. The memory hit her softly, not as pain, but as gratitude. She slipped inside. The hostess greeted her warmly. "Table for one?" Grace smiled. "Just for a moment." The pianist played softly, the scent of roasted garlic and candle wax filling the air. Everything looked different yet familiar, like time had folded neatly upon itself. She ordered tea and sat in silence, remembering the hush, the frozen stares, the weight of that long-ago truth. When the waitress returned with her cup, Grace handed her a folded napkin with a few bills tucked inside. "For your kindness," she said. The young woman frowned. "I didn't do anything special." Grace's smile deepened. "You will. Someday." As she stepped back into the snowy street, the city lights reflected in puddles, turning the pavement into rivers of gold. Her breath curled into the cold, disappearing into the night. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to teach or lead or explain. She had done what she came to do. Back home, she placed the golden bakery key beside Edward's letter on her desk. Two small objects, one born of gratitude, the other of faith, side by side. Proof that legacy could live in ordinary things. She turned off the lamp, leaving only the faint glow of the city outside her window. And as the snow fell heavier, blanketing everything in quiet mercy, Grace whispered to the darkness, half a prayer, half a memory. "May the next voice be braver than mine." Outside, the wind carried her words across the skyline through the streets, the classrooms, the boardrooms where they would linger unseen, waiting for the next soul, humble enough to speak truth to power and gentle enough to mean it. Spring returned like forgiveness, slow, tender, unannounced. The city thawed under pale sunlight, and tulips burst through the cracks in Central Park as if refusing to forget beauty. Grace had grown older, her hair now fully silver, but her posture remained straight, her gaze steady. She still walked to work most mornings, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a notebook full of restless thoughts in the other. The Hale and Palmer Foundation was entering its 10th year, and the anniversary gala was approaching. The board wanted a grand celebration at the plaza, but Grace resisted the extravagance. "If we must celebrate," she'd told them, "let's do it where our story began, somewhere ordinary." And so they rented the Meridian Room, the very restaurant where a waitress had once told a billionaire the truth. The evening of the event, Grace arrived early. The staff, young, polished, respectful, greeted her like royalty. The chandeliers glowed just as they had years ago, though everything else had changed. The walls repainted, the tables rearranged, the world different. Yet beneath the luxury, she could still feel the pulse of that night, like a heartbeat beneath fine linen. A young woman approached her, the new manager. "Miss Palmer, it's an honor to host you. My grandmother used to work here. She told me the story of the waitress who changed everything." Grace smiled softly. "I remember her well. As the guests began to arrive, philanthropists, journalists, students, workers, the air filled with laughter and the gentle hum of purpose. Grace moved through the room quietly, greeting people, asking questions, never lingering long enough to be praised. She preferred to watch others shine. When the lights dimmed and the music softened, the chairman took the stage to open the ceremony. He spoke of milestones, global programs, lives changed. Then he invited Grace to speak. She hesitated a moment before stepping forward. The crowd stood, applauding. Grace raised her hand slightly, embarrassed. "Please," she said, "sit down before you make me nervous." Laughter rippled through the room. She looked out at the sea of faces, old friends, strangers, hopeful eyes. 10 years ago, this foundation didn't exist," she began. 10 years ago, I was just a woman serving coffee to people who barely noticed me, and one of them, a man far richer, and at the time, far less wise, asked me for financial advice as a joke. A few chuckles echoed. Many knew the story by heart. "I told him the truth," Grace continued, "and for some reason, he listened. That moment taught me something I've never forgotten. It doesn't take power to speak the truth. It just takes courage to keep your voice steady when the room goes quiet." She paused, letting the words breathe. "Edward Hale isn't here tonight, but everything you see, every scholarship, every school, every life rebuilt, began because he decided to listen. And because of that, I learned another truth. Redemption isn't for the few who have fallen far, but for anyone brave enough to stand up again." The room was silent except for the faint clink of glass. Grace smiled gently. "So if you leave tonight remembering anything, let it be this: kindness scales better than any business model. and the smallest act of decency can tip the balance of an empire. Applause thundered through the restaurant, long and sincere. Grace stepped back, tears catching light like glass. After the speeches, people mingled, taking photos by the same marble pillars where the original confrontation had taken place. Grace slipped away to a quiet corner near the kitchen. The waitstaff were laughing softly, balancing trays of champagne. She watched them, their rhythm, their effort, their grace. One young server, a girl with tired eyes, noticed her and said shyly, "Miss Palmer, I hope someday I get to do something like you." Grace smiled. "You already are. You're showing up." The girl blushed, unsure what to say. Grace touched her arm lightly. "When you see someone in power, don't be afraid to tell them the truth. Just make sure you say it with kindness. That's the secret." Later, as the night wound down, the crowd dispersed into the glow of the city. The chandeliers dimmed, and the Meridian Room grew quiet again. Grace lingered by the table that had once been Edward's. She placed a single white tulip in the vase and whispered, "We kept your promise, old friend." Outside, rain began to fall, gentle, cleansing, the kind of rain that feels like renewal. Grace stepped into it without opening her umbrella. She walked slowly down Fifth Avenue, the lights of the city shimmering on wet pavement. The night hummed with memory. Laughter, music, voices rising and fading. At a crosswalk she paused, watching people hurry past bankers, delivery men, artists, dreamers, all of them chasing something invisible yet essential. For the first time in a long while, she felt no need to chase anything. She had built what she needed to build, said what she needed to say. When she reached her apartment, she left the tulip stem on her windowsill, still dripping rain. The skyline beyond glowed soft and endless. She poured herself tea and sat by the window, the city's reflection shimmering in the glass. And she thought of all the people who had passed through her story, the billionaire who found his conscience, the girl who opened a bakery, the boy who asked if truth had a face. Maybe this was how justice really worked, not as a thunderclap, but as ripples. Small, persistent, unstoppable. Grace closed her eyes, listening to the city breathe, and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't clear if she meant Edward, or the world, or simply the act of being alive long enough to see goodness multiply. Outside, the rain fell harder, and somewhere far below, a young waitress laughed, the sound rising through the night like the echo of a beginning disguised as an ending. The city moved into another winter, slower and softer than the last. Snow gathered on window ledges and muffled the sirens that usually screamed through Manhattan nights. Grace was 70 now, though her stride still carried the quiet authority of a woman who had spent a lifetime balancing gentleness with resolve. Her days began before sunrise and ended long after dark, but no longer in boardrooms. She had stepped down from the foundation's helm the previous year, insisting the next generation take over. Now, she spent her mornings at the community branch of the Hale and Palmer Institute in Harlem, teaching a small class called Money and Morality. The students ranged from teenagers to retirees, from immigrants to veterans. There were no cameras, no reporters, just chalk dust, notebooks, and conversation. That morning, as she drew a diagram on the board about value versus worth, one of the younger students, a boy named Jamal, raised his hand. "Miss Palmer," he asked, "how do you know if you've done enough?" The question hit her deeper than she expected. She smiled, setting down the chalk. "You don't. You just do what you can with what you have, and hope someone else picks up the thread when you can't hold it anymore." He nodded, writing it down like it was a formula. Grace felt a warmth bloom behind her ribs. Maybe that was all legacy really was, a thread passed hand to hand. After class, she stopped by the cafe across the street. The barista recognized her from the local news but didn't say anything, only gave her a free refill and a smile. She took her seat by the window, sipping coffee as snowflakes swirled past. The city outside had changed. Glass towers had grown taller, taxis quieter, people faster. Yet, through the blur, she could still see the outlines of her story, faint but unbroken. As she sat there, a man approached her table, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Palmer?" She looked up. "Yes?" He smiled nervously. "My name's Daniel Hale. Edward was my uncle." Grace blinked, startled, before smiling. "You have his eyes." He laughed softly. "I've been told that. I found this while sorting through some of his old files. It's addressed to you, dated a few months before he passed." Her breath caught. She reached for the package carefully, her fingers trembling. "Thank you, Daniel." He hesitated. "He spoke of you a lot, said you taught him something he'd spent a lifetime pretending to know." Grace tilted her head. "And what was that?" "That decency isn't weakness." She smiled, eyes misting. "He learned it the hard way, but he learned it well." After he left, she sat for a long while before unwrapping the parcel. Inside was a simple, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. On the first page, in Edward's familiar handwriting, were 4 words. "For the next truth?" Beneath it, in smaller print, "If you're reading this, Grace, it means the world didn't stop listening. Keep teaching them that power isn't the opposite of kindness. It's the test of it." Her throat tightened. She closed the notebook, holding it against her chest as snow melted on the window beside her. That evening, back at her apartment, she placed the notebook beside the other relics of her life. The golden key from Lila's bakery, the letter from Geneva, the tulip pressed flat inside a book of poetry. The collection looked modest, but to Grace, it felt like the weight of a cathedral, a life measured not in riches, but in resonance. A week later, she stood again at the Foundation's annual symposium, this time as a guest, not a leader. The crowd was young, diverse, full of ideas that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. When the moderator invited her to speak a few closing words, she hesitated before stepping to the microphone. "I was asked once," she began, "how you know when you've done enough. The truth is, you never do. You just do your part and hope that honesty has its own momentum." She looked out over the crowd, 1,000 faces illuminated by possibility. The man who helped start all this once believed money could buy everything. I believed honesty could fix everything. We were both wrong. It's not about buying or fixing. It's about connecting. The moment one person tells the truth, someone else remembers they can too. Her voice softened. That's how change survives through echoes, not monuments. When she stepped down, the applause was gentle, almost reverent. Someone handed her a single tulip white, just like the one she'd left on Edward's table years ago. She accepted it with a nod, her smile quiet and sure. That night she returned home and opened the window, letting the city's hum fill her room. Lights blinked across the skyline, each one a reminder that someone, somewhere, was still awake, still trying, still listening. Grace sat at her desk, writing in Edward's notebook. Her handwriting was slower now, the loops larger, but her words flowed steady. The truth doesn't belong to the brave. It belongs to the consistent. Every time we speak with kindness, we rebuild a piece of the world that power once cracked. She paused, then added, "If someone ever finds this, know that your story matters, especially when it begins in a place no one expects it to." She signed her name, closed the notebook, and leaned back. Outside, snow kept falling, covering the city in silence. She could feel its peace, its weightless forgiveness. And as she turned off the light, her reflection in the window merged with the glowing skyline, an old woman who had once been a waitress, a teacher, a reminder. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Because somewhere out there, another conversation was beginning. And with it, another truth was finding its voice. Spring arrived quietly, with pale sunlight glinting off wet streets and magnolia petals drifting through the air like confetti from an unseen parade. The city, eternal in its rush, carried on, subways rattling, horns blaring, lives intersecting for moments and vanishing again. But somewhere above that noise, in a small apartment lined with books and tulips, Grace Palmer's story was reaching its softest chapter. Her health had begun to wane, though she faced it the same way she'd faced every challenge, with calm curiosity. Mornings were slower now. Tea instead of coffee, sunlight instead of meetings. She still wrote in Edward's old notebook every day, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes only a line. The truth, she'd penned recently, ages well if tended with kindness. That morning she sat by the window watching the city wake. The bell from a nearby church chimed 9 times. On the table beside her sat the little collection of her life, the golden key from Lila, the white tulip pressed in glass, and Edward's notebook open to its last blank page. The foundation had just announced a new initiative in her name, a global program for ethical entrepreneurship. She smiled when she read the news. It wasn't vanity, only gratitude. The seed she'd planted had become a forest she might never walk through but could imagine clearly. Her doorbell rang a light, hesitant sound. When she opened it, Lila stood there, holding a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread. "You shouldn't be on your feet this early," Lila said. Grace laughed. "If I stop moving, I might turn into one of those plaques they keep naming after me." They shared breakfast, talking about the bakery's new apprentices, the Institute's latest graduates. Lila's eyes were bright. "They still teach your story. You know the Waitress and the Billionaire?" "Oh?" Grace waved a hand dismissively. "Stories are only useful when people forget who they're about." Lila frowned. "Then what are they for?" Grace looked out the window. "To remind us what we're capable of when no one's looking." When Lila left, she hugged Grace tightly. "You're the reason I believe in second chances. And you're the proof they're worth giving," Grace whispered. After she was gone, the apartment felt unusually still. Grace walked back to her desk, the morning light spilling over the page. She picked up her pen, hesitated, then began to write one final entry. There's a moment in every life when power listens to humility and understands it for the first time. That's when the world tilts, just a little, toward justice. If my story meant anything, let it remind you that decency is contagious, and so is courage. She set the pen down, closed the notebook, and laid her hand atop it as though sealing a promise. Outside, a breeze lifted the curtains. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played faint, familiar, the melody of the Meridian Room. Grace leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, the sound carrying her through time, the hum of conversation, the clink of silverware, the stunned silence after her words. It wasn't nostalgia she felt, but continuity, as if that single moment, years ago, had never ended, only widened, echoing still. Later, when the afternoon light softened into gold, a letter from the foundation arrived, announcing the first recipients of the Palmer Hale Global Fellowship. The closing line read, "For those who speak truth, serve others, and build quietly." Grace smiled, her breath steady, her heart full. She whispered into the stillness, "That's enough." When evening came, the city lights flickered on, one by one, glowing against the dusky sky. Somewhere in Brooklyn, a class began with her words written across a whiteboard. "Integrity begins when no one expects it." Somewhere else, a student quoted her in a debate. A young woman signed her first business loan without fear. The ripples went on. In that endless chain of cause and kindness, Grace Palmer became less a person and more a pulse, the echo of a truth that refused to die. And in the quiet corner of her apartment, the tulip by her window opened just as the sun dipped low, its petals catching the light one last time, as if bowing in gratitude to the woman who had taught the world how to listen.